The winter highway looked quiet under a veil of pale fog, just another ordinary afternoon, until flashing patrol lights pulled a silver sedan to the shoulder. The officer thought it was a routine stop, another driver with no voice, no power. But the woman behind the wheel sat calm hands, steady eyes, unafraid, as if she already knew something he didn't. Within minutes, engines would roar through the mist, and a hidden investigation would rise into the open, proving that truth has a way of arriving right on time. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe that sometimes justice is the miracle God sends. When courage refuses to stay silent, subscribe and stay with us until the very end. A pale winter fog drifted across the outer highway, swallowing headlights and softening the world into quiet gray. Ava Monroe drove steadily through the haze, her silver sedan humming like a patient animal that had learned to survive on endurance rather than pride. She was 38, tall and composed with deep brown skin that seemed to hold warmth even on the coldest days. Her hair was pulled into a tight low bun, practical, precise, and a pair of thin rectangular glasses rested lightly on the bridge of her nose. She wore a charcoal professional coat over a navy blouse and pressed black slacks, the kind of clean, understated attire favored by people whose authority came from preparation rather than display. To anyone passing by, she looked like another professional heading home after a long day. But there was something measured in the way she sat behind the wheel, something that suggested long practice at remaining calm in situations where calmness was the only real protection. The passenger seat held a structured leather document bag zipped and aligned neatly against the seat edge, and beside it sat a half-finished lunch container whose contents had long since gone cold. Ava rarely finished meals during the workday. Schedules had a way of slicing hours into fragments too small for comfort. Yet she did not resent the pace. Responsibility had always felt less like weight and more like direction. As she drove, her thoughts moved quietly through the tasks waiting for her that evening. Review tomorrow's legal brief, confirm a call with a federal oversight coordinator, and possibly, if time allowed, read the report she had been postponing all week. The routine steadied her. Outside, the fog thickened, turning the highway into a narrow corridor of muted light. Half a mile ahead, angled slightly behind a gravel turnout, a patrol cruiser waited with its engine idling. Inside sat Officer Colt Rayner. Rayner was a white man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck that blended into heavy shoulders, shaped less by athletic discipline and more by years spent standing with arms folded while issuing instructions. His scalp was mostly bald, the remaining hair clipped short along the sides, and when dashboard lights reflected across the smooth crown of his head, it created a faint metallic sheen that made his expression appear sharper than it was. His jaw was square, his lips thin, and a permanent crease between his brows gave the impression of someone who believed irritation was a reasonable default. His dark blue uniform stretched slightly at the waist, the polished badge shining brightly, even though the stitching beneath it sat a little crooked, suggesting a man who valued appearance but rarely noticed details once authority had been established. Nearly 20 years in the same district had shaped his instincts. Unfamiliar vehicles, unfamiliar faces, and quiet afternoons all triggered the same restless impulse to intervene. Rayner watched the approaching sedan through narrowed eyes. The car was not speeding. It was not swerving. Nothing about it demanded attention, yet something about its quiet normality irritated him. Slow shifts always did. A shift without action felt in his mind like a shift wasted. He reached for the light switch, almost casually activating the flashing red and blue beams, and pulled the cruiser onto the road behind the sedan. To him, the motion was routine. To Ava, it appeared suddenly in the rearview mirror, like a pair of sharp signals cutting through the gray. Ava noticed the lights immediately. For a brief second, her fingers tightened around the steering wheel before she consciously relaxed them. She signaled calmly and guided the car onto the shoulder, choosing a stretch of road where the ground looked stable despite the damp winter soil. Once the vehicle stopped, she placed both hands at the 10-2 position, an old habit formed from years of understanding how quickly small encounters could become large misunderstandings. Her breathing remained steady, yet beneath the steadiness, a quiet alertness settled into place. The mental posture she adopted whenever uncertainty entered the room or the road or any space where power was unevenly distributed. Raynor stepped out of the cruiser and approached with deliberate strides, boots crunching lightly against gravel. From a distance, his silhouette appeared imposing. Tall, squared shoulders, movements practiced to convey command. Up close, faint fatigue showed beneath his eyes, and there was a stiffness in his gait that hinted at an old knee injury he rarely discussed, one that had gradually shortened his patience over the years. He tapped the rear of the sedan once with his knuckles, a procedural habit, then moved toward the driver's side window. Ava lowered the glass smoothly and turned her head slightly toward him, her expression neutral, attentive, neither welcoming nor defensive. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice calm, measured, clear. Raynor paused for half a heartbeat, perhaps surprised by the composure that greeted him instead of the nervous hesitation he expected. His gaze dropped briefly to her hands still visible on the steering wheel, then returned to her face. The patrol lights reflected across the windshield, washing her features alternately in red and blue, giving the moment an almost theatrical stillness. Somewhere beyond the fog, a distant truck horn echoed faintly, but here on the roadside, the world seemed narrowed to a single quiet exchange. Raynor straightened, adjusting the position of his duty belt, and the familiar stiffness of authority returned to his posture. Ava remained still, watching him carefully, aware that tone and timing could matter more than words in moments like this. The fog shifted around them in thin drifting curls, and the blinking patrol lights painted the damp asphalt in restless color. As Raynor drew a breath and prepared to speak, neither of them yet understood that this routine, stop one of thousands that happened every day, was already moving toward consequences far larger than either person standing on that narrow strip of highway. Officer Colt Raynor leaned slightly toward the open window, the rotating patrol lights flashing across his face in restless streaks of red and blue, sharpening the lines of his already stern expression. "License and registration," he said, his voice clipped more command than request. Ava Monroe nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Certainly, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" The question was polite and calm, yet something about the steadiness in her tone unsettled him. Raynor had spent years dealing with nervous drivers, people who apologized before anything was even said. Calm people, especially calm people who asked questions, irritated him more than open defiance. He shifted his weight, the old stiffness in his knee, reminding him of the motorcycle accident years earlier that had quietly ended his chances of promotion. "Just hand over the documents," he replied, ignoring her question. Ava reached carefully toward her purse, resting on the passenger seat, and narrated her movement. "My wallet is in the bag to my right. I'm reaching for it now." Her voice remained even a habit learned from years of navigating tense professional situations where clarity prevented escalation. Raynor took the license from her hand and glanced at it briefly before looking back at her face, studying her as if he expected to find something hidden beneath the calm surface. The same composure remained, and it deepened his irritation. Behind them, a passing sedan slowed slightly, its driver curious for a moment before continuing down the fog-covered highway. "Step out of the vehicle," Raynor said abruptly. Ava paused for a brief second, not resisting, simply processing the sudden change. "May I ask what the reason is?" she asked again, her tone unchanged. "You're being asked to step out." That's the reason, he replied, the edge in his voice sharper now. Ava released her seatbelt slowly and opened the door. The cold air brushed her face as she stepped onto the damp shoulder. Standing upright movements, deliberate but unhurried. Rayner positioned himself slightly closer than necessary, an unconscious display of control. "Hands where I can see them," he added, though her hands were already visible. Ava complied without comment, noticing the thin layer of mud beginning to stain the edge of her shoes. A compact roadside assistance van approached from behind and slowed briefly as it passed. Inside sat Ethan Morales, a 24-year-old delivery driver with curly dark hair, a narrow face, and the cautious eyes of someone who had grown up learning to observe before reacting. He glanced toward the scene, one officer, one woman standing calmly beside a sedan, flashing lights cutting through the fog, then continued driving, unaware that the brief moment of attention would later matter. Back on the shoulder, the tension tightened almost invisibly. "You were weaving back there," Rayner said, introducing the accusation for the first time. "I was maintaining the speed limit in the right lane," Officer Ava replied calmly. Her answer, factual and controlled, seemed to irritate him further. He stepped slightly closer and gestured toward the front of the vehicle. "Stand over here." Ava followed the instruction. She felt the quiet shift that happens when routine procedure begins to slide towards something less predictable. It was not fear she felt, rather the alert awareness that comes when experience recognizes familiar warning signs. Rayner glanced briefly toward his cruiser, then back at her. "You people always think you know the rules," he muttered under his breath, the words low but unmistakable. Ava heard it. She did not respond. Instead, she allowed silence to hold the space, storing the phrase the way a trained professional stores details: tone, timing, sequence. Details mattered later, even when they could not help in the moment. The fog thickened slightly around them, patrol lights flashing rhythmically across the damp pavement. Rayner reached toward the sedan's door, looking inside, then turned back to her. "Stay right there," he said. Ava nodded once, calm still visible in her posture, though inside her mind a different process had begun, one that quietly prepared for whatever direction the next few minutes might take. Officer Colt Rayner opened the passenger side door of the silver sedan and began searching with the practiced impatience of someone who believed evidence was often a matter of persistence rather than probability. The patrol lights pulsed across the foggy roadside, their reflections sliding over the windshield and briefly illuminating the tidy interior of the vehicle, too clean, too orderly. The kind of order that irritated him because it offered no easy narrative of wrongdoing. He flipped open the leather document bag resting on the seat, glancing through neatly organized folders, legal papers, and clipped notes, each stack aligned with careful precision. Behind him, Ava Monroe stood still, hands visible, posture calm, though inside she could feel the quiet tension building, not from fear, but from the awareness that small moments sometimes determine the course of much larger events. She watched Rayner without speaking, her mind automatically noting details: the angle of his shoulders, the impatience in his movements, the way he paused slightly longer each time he found nothing suspicious. What he did not know, what he could not see, was that a compact black device mounted just beneath the rearview mirror had already activated a silent transmission sequence the moment the patrol lights had appeared. The sedan, old in appearance but modern in hidden design, was equipped with a federally authorized recording and uplink system that streamed encrypted video and audio directly to a secure monitoring network miles away. Hundreds of miles to the north, inside a federal coordination office housed in a plain gray building that blended easily into the government district skyline, a quiet, alert tone sounded across a monitoring console. Seated at the workstation was Daniel Cho, a systems analyst in his early 30s, with sharp cheekbones, neatly trimmed black hair, and the calm, meditative focus of someone who had spent years working in cybersecurity environments where small mistakes could ripple across entire agencies. Daniel had once served in military communications before transitioning into federal digital operations after a deployment incident that taught him how easily overlooked signals could become emergencies. He glanced at the incoming data stream notification, then leaned forward slightly as the live feed appeared on the screen. A roadside stop flashing lights, a uniformed officer moving through the vehicle, and a woman standing calmly beside the shoulder. Transmission confirmed, he murmured, opening a secure channel. Across the room, another analyst, Lena Patel, turned from her workstation. She was a slim woman in her late 20s, with warm brown skin, shoulder-length dark hair, and observant eyes, sharpened by years working as an investigative journalist before joining the federal task group. A high-profile wrongful arrest case she once covered had permanently shaped her career path, pushing her toward investigative oversight work. She crossed the room quickly, studying the footage as it stabilized. "Is that Monroe's vehicle?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Signal matches registry. Looks like we just triggered the live escalation flag." Back on the roadside, unaware of the unfolding activity far beyond the fog, Rayner continued his search. He opened the glove compartment, shifting through registration papers, spare pens, and a sealed envelope containing maintenance receipts. Nothing illegal, nothing even questionable. His jaw tightened slightly. He stepped back from the car and scanned the empty stretch of highway, as if the absence of witnesses might somehow validate the irritation growing in him. Ava remained silent, her eyes steady as he returned toward her. The wind carried a thin breath of winter cold across the shoulder, stirring the fog just enough to blur the edges of the patrol lights. Rayner stopped a few feet away, studying her again, perhaps expecting nervous movement, perhaps hoping for visible discomfort. Instead, he found the same composed posture, the same quiet patience, and that patience unsettled him more than open resistance ever could. Back in the monitoring office, Lena leaned closer to the screen. "Audio is clean," she said. "Everything's being captured." Daniel tapped a short command sequence, initiating a secondary secure archive stream. "Good," he replied, "because if this escalates, this becomes evidence." The word evidence hung quietly between them, not dramatic, not triumphant, simply procedural, the way trained professionals spoke about events that would later carry weight in hearings and courtrooms. On the roadside, the tension thickened again as Rayner adjusted the position of his belt, frustration beginning to show in the tightening of his jaw. Ava watched him calmly, sensing that the encounter had shifted into a different phase, one where the outcome was no longer determined by words alone. And somewhere beyond the fog, unseen but already moving, the chain of responses triggered by a silent signal had begun to close the distance. The first sound reached them before the vehicles appeared, a low, synchronized rumble of engines cutting through the fog like distant thunder rolling across a winter valley. Officer Colt Rayner turned his head instinctively toward the highway curve, irritation still tight in his posture, expecting perhaps another passing truck. Instead, 3 black SUVs emerged from the gray mist in tight formation headlights, cutting clean tunnels through the haze. They slowed sharply, tires crunching over the shoulder gravel, and stopped in a controlled arc around the patrol cruiser and Ava Monroe's sedan. For the first time since the stop began, Rayner felt a small flicker of uncertainty rise beneath his usual confidence, the kind of instinctive unease that comes when a familiar situation suddenly stops behaving in familiar ways. Doors opened almost simultaneously, and several federal tactical officers stepped out, their movements precise, efficient, and unmistakably coordinated. They wore dark operational jackets marked with clear federal insignia, body armor fitted close to their frame's posture, disciplined in a way that suggested long training rather than spontaneous response. Leading the team was Special Agent Marcus Hale, A tall man in his early 40s, with sharply defined facial lines, close-cropped dark hair flecked slightly with gray at the temples, and the calm, restrained intensity of someone accustomed to command decisions that carried real consequences. Hale had once served in a joint federal military task unit overseas, an experience that left him with a reputation for measured responses even in volatile situations. A thin scar along his left jawline, barely visible unless examined closely, was a reminder of an operation years earlier that had nearly ended his career and permanently shaped his refusal to underestimate small incidents. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the scene, in a single efficient sweep: the patrol vehicle, the sedan, the officer, the civilian processing the arrangement with practiced clarity. "Officer, step away from the vehicle," Hale called out, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Reiner stiffened momentarily, caught between reflex and disbelief. "This is my stop," he replied, though the firmness in his tone had already begun to weaken. Hale did not raise his voice. "Step away from the vehicle now." Behind him, 2 additional agents positioned themselves at controlled angles, not aggressive, but ready. Ava watched quietly, her breathing steady, brushing a faint layer of dried mud from the sleeve of her coat. The sudden shift in the scene did not surprise her. It felt less like an interruption and more like the arrival of something that had been moving toward this moment for months. One of the SUV's rear doors opened, and Agent Sofia Ramirez stepped out carrying a small evidence case. Ramirez was in her mid-30s, medium height, athletic build, with dark hair pulled tightly into a professional braid, and sharp, observant eyes that missed very little. She had spent years working financial corruption investigations before transferring into field operations, her colleagues often describing her as methodical to the point of quiet stubbornness, a trait developed after an early career investigation collapsed due to incomplete documentation. She positioned herself near the vehicles, already preparing digital capture equipment. Reiner looked from one agent to another, his earlier irritation replaced now by the slow realization that the structure of authority around him had changed. "What is this?" he demanded, though the question sounded less confident than intended. Hale stepped closer, stopping at a measured distance. "Officer Colt Rayner," he asked. Rayner hesitated before answering. "Yes." Hale nodded once, then gestured lightly toward Ava. "You may want to take a look at the identification she is holding." Ava reached calmly into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a dark leather credential wallet, opening it with practiced ease. The federal insignia caught the flashing patrol lights as she held it forward. "Ava Monroe," she said evenly. "Special Federal Prosecutor, Internal Police Corruption Task Authority." The words did not need emphasis. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the SUV engines and the rotating patrol lights reflecting across the damp pavement. Rayner stared at the badge, his expression shifting through confusion, disbelief, and finally uneasy comprehension that the situation had moved far beyond routine procedure. Hale gave a small nod to the agents behind him. "Officer Rayner, please place your hands where we can see them." The command was calm, procedural, final. Rayner hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to feel the weight of the moment before slowly raising his hands. The metallic click of restraints closing around his wrists sounded sharper than the wind moving across the open highway. Ava remained still, watching without satisfaction, only quiet acknowledgement. Months of preparation had led to a moment that looked almost ordinary. From a distance, a roadside stop, a few vehicles, a small group of people standing beneath flashing lights. Yet, in the invisible layers beneath the scene reports, recordings, investigations, waiting warrants, the structure of an entire local network had already begun to shift. Hale turned slightly toward Ramirez. "Secure the recording chain and mark the scene." She nodded, already moving. Rayner stood silent, now staring toward the fog-covered highway, perhaps realizing that the authority he had relied upon for years had changed hands in less than a minute. And as the rotating lights continued to flash across the damp winter road, the quiet transfer of control that had begun long before this stop finally completed itself. The arrest of Officer Colt Rayner was only the first movement in a sequence that had been building quietly for months. And by the time the patrol lights faded from the roadside that evening, the larger mechanism had already begun to turn. Within hours, sealed federal vehicles arrived at the Shadyside Police Department, their presence drawing cautious glances from late-shift officers who sensed something unusual before any announcement was made. Leading the warrant execution team was Assistant Director Helen Crawford, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair worn in a precise shoulder-length cut, and a posture that reflected decades of courtroom battles and internal investigations. Crawford had built her reputation on patience rather than spectacle. Colleagues often described her as someone who spoke quietly, yet dismantled entire corruption networks piece by piece. Years earlier, she had prosecuted a municipal fraud case that nearly collapsed after key evidence disappeared, an experience that shaped her relentless insistence on procedural precision. She walked into the precinct lobby carrying a slim leather portfolio. Her expression composed her eyes, scanning the room with calm certainty. Officers were asked to step aside while federal evidence teams entered, moving methodically through records rooms, computer systems, and storage lockers. Evidence cabinets were sealed hard drives cataloged and personnel quietly separated for questioning. The process was not loud or dramatic. It was systematic, the unmistakable sound of institutional momentum shifting direction. Over the following weeks, the investigation widened, uncovering falsified arrest reports, improperly handled evidence, and a pattern of misconduct stretching across several years. Some officers cooperated quickly, others attempted denial, but the combination of digital recordings, archived case reviews, and sworn testimony formed a structure too solid to dismantle. Several wrongful convictions were reopened, their files revisited by independent review boards, now authorized under an emergency oversight directive passed by the state legislature. Among the legal reform advocates assisting the review process was Dr. Julian Mercer, a tall, soft-spoken civil rights policy analyst in his early 40s, with a narrow build, neatly trimmed beard, and thoughtful manner shaped by years working with exoneration programs. Mercer had once represented a client who spent 11 years incarcerated for a crime, later proven impossible, an experience that permanently directed his career towards systemic reform. He worked long evenings with legislative teams, drafting the framework for a new civilian oversight system, requiring continuous body camera recording during patrol activity and independent audit access to departmental disciplinary files. The proposed reforms met resistance at first, yet mounting evidence made opposition increasingly difficult to sustain. And within months, the measures were approved, marking the most comprehensive oversight restructuring the county had seen in decades. Nearly a year later, Winter returned to the same stretch of highway where the original stop had occurred. The fog that morning was thinner, lighter, the road quieter. Ava Monroe drove along the familiar route again, her silver sedan moving at a steady pace, though the landscape around her had changed in subtle ways. The old patrol observation turnout was gone, replaced by a paved shoulder and a newly installed roadside sign marking the boundary of a public safety improvement zone. A few miles farther ahead stood a modest new building with clean glass panels and a simple engraved plaque reading Community Justice Center, a facility designed to house legal assistance offices, public complaint intake desks, and independent review coordinators. Ava slowed briefly as she passed, not out of nostalgia, but acknowledgement. She had never considered the investigation a personal victory. It had always been a process, one that began long before that winter evening, and would continue long after the headlines faded. As she continued driving, the road opened ahead, traffic moving normally, drivers passing without hesitation. There were no patrol vehicles waiting in shadowed turnouts, no sudden flashes of emergency lights interrupting the calm. Ava rested her hands lightly on the steering wheel, her expression thoughtful rather than celebratory. Systems changed slowly, she knew, and no single case transformed everything. Yet sometimes a single moment revealed where change needed to begin. The roadside where the stop had occurred was now marked by a small landscaped strip of winter grass and a short row of newly planted trees, their branches bare but steady against the pale sky. Ava drove past without stopping, the sedan continuing forward into the open highway, the quiet promise of ordinary travel restored to the space where fear had once stood. And somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the administrative and legal reforms set in motion by that single encounter continued to reshape institutions that had remained unchanged for years. Their progress steady, procedural, and irreversible. Sometimes justice does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly through courage, patience, and the small decisions people make when no one is watching. And perhaps that is where miracles truly begin, not in the sky, but in the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to look away. May God remind us each day that kindness is never wasted, that standing for what is right always plants seeds we may not immediately see grow. In our daily lives, on the road, at work, in the way we treat strangers, we each carry the power to make someone feel safer, seen, and protected. If this story touched your heart, share it so more people can remember that goodness still moves through this world. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what moment in the story stayed with you the most. Subscribe to the channel to continue walking with us through stories of courage, compassion, and redemption. May God bless you, your family, and everyone who is watching today. May peace follow you on every road you travel, and may light always find you, especially when the world feels heavy.